Alright, so today we're going to talk about the technological revolution, which was a huge part of the second industrial revolution that again lasted from the late 1800s, 1860, 1870 through the early 1900s, 1914 or so. So to start us off, we're going to start by talking about Samuel Morse. He was an American painter and inventor, and he patented the telegraph in 1844. He used Morse code for the first time and marked the beginning of the Second Industrial Revolution. Understand that the Industrial Revolution was filled with inventors and scientists backed by business leaders who created an explosion of inventions and improvements that would forever change people's lives. The telegraph also revolutionized communications throughout the world, and Samuel Morse played a major role in this revolution. After the telegraph, communication no longer depended on the length of time it took to hand-carry messages from one location to another. The speed of telegraphy modernized business and personal communication in a rapid manner. Within a few decades of Morse's patent, telegraph wires spanned the globe. It also led to new inventions in communication like the telephone in 1876. The Second Industrial Revolution took place again from 1817 to 1914, while the First Industrial Revolution, which again you should have covered in your history course last year, lasted from 1760 to the 1850s or so. Alright, so daily life in 1865. There was no indoor electric lighting. We had no electricity in 1865. So typically people got up when the sun was rising and went to sleep when the sun went down. Unless you had a lot of money and you could afford oil lamps or candles, then obviously you could use those at night. There was no refrigeration and no ice unless, again, you had a lot of money because it was very expensive to get ice. You actually had to cut out a piece of ice from a frozen pond and then store it in an ice house to use later on. Mail also took days to go from the East Coast, 10 days to be exact, to go from the East Coast to the Midwest, and 3 weeks to get to the West. News from Europe took months to reach the U.S., so communication was extremely difficult during this time. Technological investments. So 500,000 patents were granted from 1860 to 1890. Now, previously, so from 1790 to 1860, there had been only 36,000 patents. So this was a huge improvement. We go from 36,000 to 500,000. What are patents? Patents are just licenses that give an inventor the exclusive right to make, use, or sell an invention for a set period of time. Some of the inventions that we saw through 1860 to 1890 were the invention of the typewriter, the telephone, and the phonograph. Business leaders began to invest in inventions and technology, and this led to new industries and then the expansion of old ones. Investments made the U.S. have the highest standard of living in the world. Again, this achievement was the result of the nation's growing industrial productivity, the amount of goods and services created in a given period of time. Goods were now more available than they ever had been before, and we started to see a lot of communications advancements, and transportation was also made easier than it had ever been before. Alright, so you could get from one place to another much quicker, and you also could communicate with people on the other side of the world a lot faster. So what forced the U.S. transformation? There were three major factors that pushed the U.S. from an agricultural society or farming society to an industrial nation or industry or factory work type of nation. So there was a wealth of natural resources, there was an explosion of inventions and business leaders to invest, and there was a growing urban population that provided new markets. We start to see a lot of people moving to the city, which was known as urbanization, and we also see a lot of immigration to this area as well. And that created the labor force for us. We also see new forms of energy, such as kerosene, was clean burning fuel for indoor lighting. We also see petroleum, which is an oil, began to be used. Petroleum was a byproduct of kerosene. Advancements in energy led to gasoline, which is used for the automobile today. So just to give you a little background on where we get gasoline, Abraham Gessner, he creates kerosene, which is distilled from crude oil. And then Edwin Drake created the steam engine for oil drilling. Now, gasoline is extracted from that petroleum and used for the newly created automobile. So how did inventions impact the U.S.? Well, electricity led to many important advances in the nation's industrial development and changes people's eating, working, and even sleeping habits. People could now wake up earlier or stay up later if they had lighting in their home. Food was more available than it had ever been before. And working. People went from working on the farm to working in the factory. This leads to more inventions, especially new inventions that would help speed production. New products and lifestyles, new inventions led to longer hours for laborers. This also meant not only are we waking up earlier and staying up later in our home, but also we are working longer hours because there's lighting to do so. Consumerism and advertising became important. We started spending money on these goods and services that are now available. And we also start to see advertising for the first time where people are trying to sell their products and they're advertising that product. Recreational inventions increase like the camera, the bicycle, and the phonograph. Transportation in the 1850s. There were steam-powered ships that still provided most transportation in the U.S. Railroads became the best, safest, and fastest means of transportation in the U.S. They weren't always. And during the Civil War, millions of dollars were put into creating a train track network. All right, so it's important that you understand that before the Civil War, most of the nation's railroad tracks were in short lines that connected neighboring cities, mainly in the east. Since there was no standard track width or gauge, each train could only travel on certain tracks. As a result, goods and passengers often had to move to different trains, which caused costly delays. So they couldn't stay on one train the entire time they were traveling because, again, the tracks didn't match up. So they had to get on a different train, which, again, just took more time. To make matters worse, train travel was dangerous. No system of standard signals existed, and train brakes were unreliable. Not to mention, early on, the railroad tracks were made out of iron, which crumbled pretty easily, and until they were made out of steel, they didn't really become the safest, fastest means of transportation. Okay, so Transcontinental Railroad. This was a railroad that extended from coast to coast, Omaha, Nebraska, to Sacramento, California. Railroad companies project was funded by government money. From Omaha towards the west, the Union Pacific Railroad, and then from Sacramento towards the east was the Central Pacific Railroad. Because private investors did see the profit from building a railroad that extended coast to coast, the government stepped in to fund the project because they didn't see the profit they could gain from it. So Congress believed that a railroad would strengthen the country's economic infrastructure. Most of the workers were immigrants, and the railroad was built in 7 years, finished in May 1869. So if we look at this map here, again, from Omaha towards the west, so Omaha here towards the west, this was known as the Union Pacific Railroad. And then from Sacramento to the east, this here was known as the Central Pacific Railroad. And there's another image down here that might be a little bit easier for you to understand. Okay, railroad travel. So there were some pros. The railroad was great for transporting goods. Railroads created faster shipping times and cheaper shipping prices. And the creation of national markets. East Coast products were now could be sold in the West because of the train travel. They were very noisy, dirty, and uncomfortable for travelers at first. And who was paying for the railroad? Taxpayers or private investors. And obviously understand that railroad travel gets a lot better, but starting out, it really was uncomfortable for travelers. So railroad developments. We start to see the development of steel rails replaced iron, technology, air brakes to stop the train in emergencies, and railroad and time zones. So railroads are one of the main contributors to the creation of time zones. This is because during the 1800s, there were no set time or time zones. Each village, city set their own clocks based on solar time. Until 1883, there was mass confusion because of time differences. As a result, railroads adopted a national system of time zones to improve scheduling. Now clocks in broad regions of the country showed the same time, a system we still use today. This would help with traveling, because then when you travel from place to place, and especially from time zone to time zone, you would know exactly what time your your train was traveling, if you just knew the time zones and how they worked and how they were different from one another. The growth of railroads also led to the development of many towns in the West, because again, now you could travel to the West much faster, and so settling there wasn't such a big decision, because you could travel easily back to the East if need be. Railroad owners looking to expand their businesses and increase profits began building these towns near the railroads. This land was granted to them by the government. All right, the Bessemer process. Henry Bessemer invented a process to make steel at a fraction of the price. Before steel, iron was used. Iron is very brittle when cold and doesn't have the strength of steel. Steel had the ability to be lighter, stronger, and more flexible with iron. With the Bessemer creation, steel could now be mass-produced. So why was steel so important? Through the mid-1800s, the nation depended on iron for railroads, rails, and frames of large buildings. Steel was made by melting iron, adding carbon, and removing impurities. The Bessemer process made it much easier to remove the impurities. Contamination, pollution, and taint is what essentially impurities are. Steel and the Bessemer process were so important because it led to a new age of building, like the Brooklyn Bridge. Also, because steel was much lighter, buildings could be essentially a lot taller, but yet still strong enough to stand tall, stand strong.